The morning my husband slipped his wedding ring into his coat pocket instead of his finger, he had no idea I was standing in the hallway, watching, holding the very invitation to the gala he thought I'd never see. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in hope, and in the quiet power of second chances, then before this story unfolds, I want to invite you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Every story we tell here belongs to our community, and it's your presence that gives these journeys meaning. My name is Vivian Sorrell, and for 13 years I built my entire identity around being Wesley Sorrell's wife. Wesley was a name people recognized in certain circles, Vice President of Client Relations at Bexley & Thorn Logistics, a mid-sized but rapidly growing freight and shipping firm that had, over the past decade, become one of the most competitive players in the region. I met Wesley when I was 24, fresh out of business school, working as a junior financial analyst at a firm 2 floors below his office. He was magnetic back then, full of ambition and charm, the kind of man who made you feel like the only person in a crowded room. I fell for him quickly, and when he proposed 18 months later, I said yes without hesitation, believing we were building something that would only grow stronger with time. What I didn't anticipate was how much of myself I would slowly hand over in the years that followed. When our daughter Rosalind was born, followed 2 years later by our son Desmond, Wesley and I agreed, in what felt like a mutual decision at the time, that I would step back from my career to raise our children while he focused on climbing the corporate ladder. I told myself it was temporary, that once the children were older I would return to finance, perhaps start my own consulting practice. But temporary decisions have a way of calcifying into permanent identities, and somewhere between school recitals, pediatrician appointments, and endless loads of laundry, I stopped being Vivian the analyst and became simply Wesley's wife, a role I wore with pride for years, until pride slowly eroded into something closer to invisibility. The signs had been there for months before that morning in the hallway, though I had convinced myself otherwise. Wesley began working later, missing dinners he used to insist on attending, growing distant during the rare weekends we spent together as a family. He started dressing differently, more meticulously, favoring cologne he never used to wear. When I asked him about it, he waved away my concerns with the practiced ease of a man who had grown accustomed to being believed without question. I wanted to trust him. I had built my entire adult life around trusting him. But that morning, standing frozen in the hallway of our home, watching him slide his wedding ring into his coat pocket rather than onto his hand, something inside me finally refused to look away any longer. I said nothing in that moment. Instead, I retreated quietly to our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed we had shared for over a decade, staring at the invitation I'd received the week before from Bexley & Thorn's executive office, the annual Autumn Founders Gala, an elegant afternoon event held each year in the grand ballroom of the Ashford Hotel downtown, celebrating the company's biggest clients, partners, and achievements. Wesley had mentioned, almost too casually, that he wouldn't need me to attend this year, that it would be mostly business talk and I would likely find it tedious. I had accepted his explanation at the time, disappointed but not suspicious. Now, holding that same invitation in my trembling hands, I understood exactly why he hadn't wanted me there. Later that afternoon, unable to sit with my suspicions any longer, I drove to Bexley & Thorn's headquarters under the pretense of dropping off Wesley's forgotten laptop charger, something I had done countless times before without a second thought. As I approached the glass doors of the executive floor, I saw them through the window before I saw anyone else, Wesley standing close to a woman I didn't recognize, his hand resting on the small of her back in a gesture far too familiar for a colleague, both of them laughing at something only they seemed to understand. The woman, elegant and confident in a way that made my chest tighten, was Bianca Renfrew, a newer account executive who had joined the firm 8 months earlier. I stood frozen on the other side of that glass door for what felt like an eternity, watching my husband exist in a version of intimacy I hadn't seen from him in years, offered so effortlessly to someone else. I didn't confront him that day. Some cruelties require preparation rather than impulse, and I needed time to understand not just what was happening, but who I had become in the process of losing myself to a marriage that no longer seemed to include me as an equal partner. Instead, I drove home in silence, tucked the laptop charger into my bag, and began quietly piecing together a plan that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with reclaiming a version of myself I had nearly forgotten existed. That version of myself had a name too, one that predated Wesley entirely. Before I became Vivian Sorrell, wife and mother, I had been Vivian Hartley, a sharp, ambitious analyst with a reputation for spotting inefficiencies that seasoned executives overlooked. During my years away from formal employment, I hadn't been entirely idle. I had quietly kept my financial certifications current, attending occasional continuing education courses under the guise of personal enrichment, telling myself it was simply a hobby, a way to keep my mind engaged. In truth, some part of me had always known I might need this skill set again someday, though I never imagined the circumstances that would finally bring it back into use. 3 months before that devastating afternoon outside Wesley's office, fate had placed me at a charity fundraiser hosted by the Ashford Foundation, an event I attended reluctantly at the insistence of my closest friend, Colette Marchetti, who had all but dragged me out of my increasingly isolated existence. It was there that I reconnected with Julian Ashworth, a man I had known briefly during my early career, back when he was a junior associate at a rival firm and I was still finding my footing as an analyst. Julian had since become CEO of Ashworth Global Freight, one of the most respected logistics conglomerates on the Eastern Seaboard, a company whose name commanded quiet respect throughout the industry. He recognized me instantly across the crowded ballroom, and within minutes we had fallen into easy conversation, catching up on the years that had passed between us. Julian had always been perceptive, and it didn't take him long to notice the guarded sadness beneath my polite smiles that evening. He didn't push, didn't pry, simply extended an open invitation to meet for coffee sometime, no pressure, just an old friend reaching out. I hadn't expected to take him up on it, but loneliness has a way of making small kindnesses feel like lifelines, and 2 weeks later I found myself sitting across from him at a quiet cafe downtown, discussing everything from industry trends to the quiet erosion of identity that can happen within a marriage built on unequal sacrifice. Julian listened in a way Wesley hadn't in years, genuinely curious about my thoughts, my ideas, the analytical mind I had spent over a decade suppressing in favor of domestic harmony. What began as friendly coffee meetings slowly evolved into something entirely unexpected but never romantic in nature. Julian, impressed by insights I offered almost instinctively during our conversations about supply chain inefficiencies plaguing his company's newest acquisition, offered me a position as an independent consultant, working remotely, analyzing operational bottlenecks that his own internal team had struggled to identify. I accepted under my maiden name, Vivian Hartley, partly out of caution, partly because some quiet, wounded part of me wanted to rebuild this piece of my identity without Wesley's shadow attached to it. For the first time in over a decade, I had something entirely my own, a professional identity built on my own merit rather than my proximity to my husband's career. The work reignited something in me I hadn't realized had gone dormant. I threw myself into research late at night after the children were asleep, analyzing shipping routes, cost structures, vendor relationships, and inefficiencies that had been quietly draining Julian's newest division of profitability. Within 6 weeks, I had identified nearly $2 million in potential annual savings through restructured vendor contracts and optimized routing systems, insights that left Julian's senior leadership team stunned during a presentation I delivered remotely, my face obscured by professional distance, my competence speaking louder than my presence ever could. It was during this same period that Wesley's behavior grew increasingly distant, his attention consumed by whatever was developing between himself and Bianca Renfrew, though I hadn't yet confirmed the full extent of their relationship. Our children noticed the tension too, in the way children always do, even when adults believe they're shielding them successfully. Rosalind, then 11 years old and achingly perceptive, asked me one evening why Daddy seemed to be home less and smiling less when he was there. I gave her the kind of vague, protective answer parents give when they're still processing their own uncertainty, promising her that everything would be all right, though I wasn't entirely certain I believed it myself. The truth crystallized fully on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, 3 weeks before the Autumn Founders Gala. I had gone to pick up dry cleaning for Wesley, a mundane errand I'd performed hundreds of times throughout our marriage, when I discovered a receipt tucked into the pocket of his suit jacket, still hanging in its garment bag, a receipt for a hotel room booked for that same weekend, dated during a trip Wesley had told me was a mandatory business conference in another city. I called the hotel directly, and after some gentle probing disguised as confusion over a reservation, learned that the room had indeed been booked for 2 guests. I didn't need to hear another word to understand exactly what had been happening beneath the surface of my marriage for months. I sat in my car in the dry cleaner's parking lot for nearly an hour that afternoon, sunlight streaming through the windshield, illuminating dust particles floating in the still air, and I allowed myself, finally, to grieve, not just the betrayal itself, but the years I had spent shrinking myself to accommodate a partnership that had apparently stopped being mutual long before I noticed. I grieved the version of myself who had genuinely believed that love required constant sacrifice without reciprocity, who had convinced herself that being just a housewife, a phrase Wesley had used dismissively more than once during arguments about my desire to return to work, was somehow a lesser identity than the one he had built for himself. But grief, I discovered that afternoon, has a way of clarifying rather than paralyzing, once you allow yourself to fully feel it rather than suppress it. By the time I drove home, something had shifted within me, quiet but unmistakable, like a foundation settling into its true shape after years of misalignment. I decided, in that moment, that I would not confront Wesley with tears or accusations, not yet. Instead, I would allow the truth to reveal itself naturally, in its own time, on my own terms. That opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. 2 weeks before the gala, Julian called to inform me that Ashworth Global Freight had entered preliminary merger discussions with none other than Bexley and Thorne Logistics, a development that would significantly expand Ashworth's regional presence while providing Bexley and Thorne with the capital infusion needed for their ambitious expansion plans. Julian explained that he had been invited, as a courtesy extended to potential merger partners, to attend Bexley and Thorne's upcoming Autumn Founders Gala as a guest of honor, an invitation he hadn't yet decided whether to accept given his typically reserved approach to corporate social events. I don't know what compelled me to tell him everything in that moment, sitting in my kitchen with afternoon light filtering through the window above the sink, but something about the timing felt too significant to ignore. I told Julian about Wesley, about Bianca, about the hotel receipt and the dismissive comments and 13 years of gradually disappearing into a role that had stopped honoring who I actually was. Julian listened without interruption, his silence patient rather than pitying, and when I finished, he simply said that if I was comfortable with it, he would be honored to attend the gala with me, not as any kind of romantic gesture, but as genuine recognition of the professional partnership we had built together, one Wesley knew nothing about. I spent the following 2 weeks in a state I can only describe as quiet transformation. I completed my consulting analysis for Ashworth Global's newest acquisition, presenting findings that ultimately saved the division nearly $3 million annually, a fact Julian insisted on sharing with his board despite my initial hesitation. I began exercising again, not out of vanity, but because movement helped me process emotions I had spent years suppressing. I reconnected with Colette and other friendships I had allowed to fade during years of prioritizing Wesley's career over my own social and professional life. Slowly, deliberately, I began remembering who Vivian Hartley had been before she became simply Wesley's wife. The morning of the gala arrived with unusually bright autumn sunlight, golden and clear, streaming through our bedroom windows as I watched Wesley prepare for what he believed would be an uncomplicated afternoon of professional networking followed by a stolen evening with his mistress. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought while adjusting his tie in the mirror, that he'd already arranged for a colleague to serve as his +1, since I likely wouldn't enjoy the event anyway. I simply nodded, offering no resistance, no visible reaction, allowing him to believe his deception remained perfectly intact. He left our home that morning without a backward glance, taking with him not just his overnight bag for what he described as a post-gala business dinner, but any remaining illusion I harbored about the marriage I had once believed was unshakable. I spent that afternoon not plotting revenge, but reclaiming myself piece by piece. I visited a boutique downtown I hadn't set foot in for years, purchasing a deep sapphire gown that made me feel, for the first time in longer than I could remember, genuinely beautiful rather than simply presentable. I had my hair styled the way I used to wear it during my early career years, before motherhood and marriage had quietly rearranged my priorities around everyone's needs but my own. When I looked in the mirror before Julian arrived to collect me, I didn't see Wesley's overlooked wife staring back. I saw Vivian Hartley, financial strategist, a woman capable of holding her own in any room she chose to enter. Julian arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit that spoke of quiet confidence rather than ostentatious wealth. When he saw me descend the staircase of my home, his expression held genuine warmth and respect, the kind of regard I hadn't felt directed toward me in longer than I cared to admit. He offered his arm not as a romantic gesture, but as a gesture of solidarity between colleagues who had built something meaningful together, entirely separate from the wreckage of my marriage. Walking into the grand ballroom of the Ashford Hotel that afternoon, golden autumn light spilling through towering windows onto crystal chandeliers suspended above elegantly dressed guests, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes not from certainty about outcomes, but from certainty about one's own worth. I spotted Wesley before he spotted me, standing near the center of the room, laughing at something Bianca had said, his hand resting with practiced familiarity against the small of her back, precisely as I had witnessed weeks earlier through the glass doors of his office. The moment Wesley's eyes finally landed on me, his laughter died mid-breath, replaced by an expression of pure disbelief that quickly cascaded into something resembling panic when he registered exactly who stood beside me. Julian Ashworth, CEO of the company whose merger negotiations would determine the financial future of Bexley and Thorne Logistics, including the security of Wesley's own position, was standing in the middle of the ballroom with his arm linked through mine, greeting colleagues and executives with the easy confidence of a man completely at home in his own success. I did not rush toward Wesley. I did not create a scene or demand an immediate confrontation. Instead, I allowed the natural rhythm of the event to unfold, greeting executives I had once been introduced to years earlier as simply Wesley's wife, watching their expressions shift from polite recognition to genuine curiosity as Julian introduced me properly, this time as Vivian Hartley, the financial consultant whose analysis had significantly contributed to Ashworth Global's recent operational improvements. Conversations that had once been perfunctory pleasantries became genuine professional exchanges, colleagues asking my opinion on merger logistics, supply chain optimization, and market positioning, questions I answered with the confidence of someone who had spent months proving her expertise on her own merit. Bianca, sensing the shifting dynamics around her, gradually withdrew toward the perimeter of the room, her earlier confidence visibly deflating under the weight of curious glances now directed her way. Wesley, meanwhile, seemed caught between maintaining his professional composure for the benefit of watching colleagues and processing the seismic shift occurring within his understanding of both his marriage and his career security. He approached me near the dessert table roughly an hour into the event, his voice low and urgent, requesting a private conversation. We stepped onto the hotel's expansive terrace together, bathed in the soft amber light of late afternoon sun beginning its gradual descent, though several hours of daylight still remained. Wesley's carefully constructed composure crumbled almost immediately once we were alone, his hands trembling slightly as he attempted to explain, then justify, then finally simply confess to the affair he had been conducting with Bianca for nearly 5 months. He admitted, voice cracking with what appeared to be genuine anguish, that he had convinced himself our marriage had become stagnant, that my role as primarily a mother and homemaker had somehow made me less interesting, less relevant to the ambitious trajectory of his career. He confessed that watching me walk into that ballroom beside Julian Ashworth, radiant and clearly respected by everyone present, had shattered the narrative he'd constructed to justify his own choices. I listened to his confession without interrupting, allowing him to fully articulate the justifications he had built for himself over months of deception. When he finished, I told him, as calmly as I could manage despite the emotion churning beneath my composed exterior, that raising our children and managing our household had never made me smaller or less capable, it had simply required a different kind of strength than the one he valued in his professional world, a strength he had apparently stopped recognizing or appreciating somewhere along the way. I explained that his failure to see my worth reflected far more about his own limitations than any genuine deficiency in who I was or what I contributed to our family and marriage. I did not offer immediate forgiveness on that terrace, because forgiveness extended too quickly rarely holds lasting meaning. Instead, I told Wesley that whatever happened between us moving forward would depend entirely on whether he was willing to demonstrate, through sustained action rather than momentary panic, genuine accountability for the pain he had caused, not just to me, but to our children, whose stability and trust had also been jeopardized by his choices. I told him I needed space to determine who I was outside the marriage that had consumed my identity for over a decade, and that any path toward reconciliation would require patience, humility, and consistent proof of change rather than desperate promises made in the heat of exposure. The weeks following the gala unfolded with a complexity that defied simple resolution. Wesley moved temporarily into a small apartment near his office, not as punishment, but as necessary space for both of us to process what our marriage had become and what it might potentially become again, if genuine repair proved possible. The merger between Ashworth Global Freight and Bexley and Thorne Logistics proceeded forward, though Wesley's position within the newly combined company became noticeably less secure once leadership discovered the extent of his workplace relationship with Bianca, a situation that ultimately resulted in her departure from the company entirely, while Wesley remained, though under considerably more scrutiny than before. During this period of separation, my professional relationship with Julian and Ashworth Global Freight expanded significantly. What began as informal consulting work evolved into a full-time position leading a newly created division focused on operational efficiency and supply chain optimization, a role that finally allowed me to fully utilize the analytical skills I had spent over a decade suppressing in favor of domestic responsibilities. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I woke each morning with a sense of purpose entirely independent from my identity as someone's wife or mother, though I remained, as always, deeply devoted to Rosalind and Desmond throughout this transitional period. Wesley, to his credit, did not disappear into bitterness or defensive rationalization once the initial shock of exposure subsided. He began attending individual therapy, then eventually couples counseling once I felt ready to explore that possibility, though I made clear that participation didn't guarantee reconciliation, only genuine effort toward understanding what had fractured within our marriage and within himself. He apologized to Rosalind and Desmond without excuses or deflection, acknowledging the pain his choices had caused their sense of family security. He began showing up consistently in small, unglamorous ways, picking up the children from school activities, learning to cook meals I had prepared for years without acknowledgement, asking genuine questions about my new professional responsibilities rather than dismissing them as secondary to his own career ambitions. Rebuilding trust, I discovered throughout that difficult year, rarely resembles the dramatic gestures often portrayed in stories of reconciliation. Instead, it happens in accumulated moments of quiet consistency, in Tuesday afternoons where two people choose honesty over comfortable avoidance, in gradually accumulated evidence that genuine change is occurring rather than simply performed for temporary effect. Wesley attended every therapy session without complaint, engaged authentically in difficult conversations about accountability and respect, and slowly, incrementally, began demonstrating the kind of partnership I had unknowingly been starving for throughout our marriage's later years. It took nearly 14 months before I could hear Wesley's voice without immediately recalling the sting of watching him touch Bianca's back with such practiced familiarity, before the phrase, "just a housewife," stopped echoing painfully whenever I closed my eyes at night. But gradually, watching him genuinely transform into someone who valued partnership over unilateral ambition, who recognized and celebrated my professional achievements rather than feeling threatened by them, I found space within myself for authentic forgiveness, not because Wesley automatically deserved it, but because holding indefinitely onto anger would have ultimately kept me trapped within the very smallness he had once mistakenly assigned to my identity. We did not simply return to our previous marriage, because that particular version of our relationship, built on unequal sacrifice and unspoken resentment, needed to remain firmly in the past. Instead, we constructed something entirely new together, a partnership where my career mattered as genuinely as his, where mutual respect replaced assumed hierarchy, where both of us actively contributed to nurturing not just our children's well-being, but our own individual growth and our collective partnership. Rosalind, now a perceptive 13-year-old, once told me she admired how I had figured out how to be strong and kind at the same time, a comment that brought unexpected tears to my eyes, recognizing that even through our family's most difficult season, my children had witnessed something valuable about resilience and self-respect. Before I share how this story ultimately settled into its truest ending, I want to ask you something meaningful. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone's true character was finally revealed, when circumstances stripped away pretense and showed you exactly who someone truly was, for better or worse? I'd love for you to share your reflections in the comments below, because these conversations are precisely what make our community here so meaningful and supportive for everyone walking through their own difficult seasons. Looking back now, nearly 3 years removed from that transformative autumn afternoon, I understand that the gala itself was never truly about Julian, or professional validation, or even proving Wesley wrong for his careless dismissal of my worth. It was about the precise moment I stopped waiting for external validation to confirm my value and instead walked into that room already believing it myself. Julian remained a valued professional colleague and genuine friend throughout the following years, eventually meeting and marrying a wonderful woman named Fiona, whom I had the privilege of getting to know during their courtship, our friendship never once compromised by anything beyond mutual professional respect and genuine platonic care. Wesley and I, meanwhile, continue building our reconstructed marriage with intentional care, understanding that trust, once broken, requires ongoing tending rather than assumed permanence. We recently celebrated our 16th wedding anniversary, not with grand romantic gestures, but with a quiet dinner where we openly discussed how far we traveled from that painful autumn, acknowledging both the pain that nearly ended us and the genuine growth that ultimately strengthened what remained. My career at Ashworth Global Freight continues flourishing, and I recently accepted a promotion to Senior Director, a title that would have seemed impossibly distant to the version of myself who once believed her only worth lay in domestic sacrifice. Every person deserves genuine recognition, not merely for the roles they perform within someone else's narrative, but for the full complexity of strength, intelligence, and capacity for love they carry within their own individual identity. If this story touched something meaningful within you, please like this video, leave a heartfelt comment sharing your own reflections, share it with someone in your life who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey exploring resilience, forgiveness, and the quiet power of rediscovering your own worth. Thank you, truly, for being part of our family here, for believing wholeheartedly in second chances, and for walking alongside these stories of hope and healing with us, one honest, heartfelt journey at a time.